two empires, two galaxies, two philosophies of absolute power stretched across the cold silence of infinite space. One is ruled by ancient bloodlines, spice, and the quiet terror of tradition. The other is forged in the fires of industrial supremacy, held together by the mechanical hum of a battle station capable of erasing entire worlds. Tonight, we are going to pull apart these two towering monuments of science fiction and ask a question that cuts to the heart of how civilizations control the fate of billions. Which method of galactic domination is more effective, more enduring, and more terrifying? The feudal web of the Corrino Imperium from Frank Herbert's Dune, or the centralized iron fist of Emperor Palpatine's Galactic Empire from Star Wars? To answer that, we need to go all the way back to the beginning. Not to the stories themselves, but to the very foundations upon which these empires were built. The Corrino Imperium did not emerge overnight. It was not the product of a single ambitious tyrant seizing control in a dramatic political coup. The Imperium was old, impossibly, almost incomprehensibly old. The Golden Lion throne had been occupied by members of House Corrino for over 10,000 years by the time Paul Atreides set foot on Arrakis. Think about that for a moment. 10,000 years of unbroken dynastic rule. To put that into perspective, the entirety of recorded human history on Earth spans roughly 5,000 years. The Corrinos doubled that. Their reign stretched back to the aftermath of the Butlerian Jihad, that great and terrible crusade against thinking machines that reshaped the entire trajectory of human civilization. When the last of the sentient computers and robots were destroyed, humanity was left with a void, not just technological, but political and philosophical. The prohibitions that emerged from that war were absolute. Thou shalt not make a machine in the likeness of a human mind. That single commandment forced humanity to develop in radically different directions, giving rise to the Mentats, the Bene Gesserit, and the Spacing Guild, human institutions designed to replace the functions that machines had once performed. And in the power vacuum that followed the jihad, House Corrino, through a combination of military prowess, political cunning, and sheer ruthless ambition, claimed the throne and established what would become the longest continuous dynasty in the history of science fiction. But claiming a throne and holding it are two very different things. The genius of the Corrino system was that the Padishah emperor never truly ruled alone. He sat at the center of a vast, intricate web of power sharing that Frank Herbert designed with the precision of an ecologist mapping a food chain. Below the emperor, the Landsraad, a great council of noble houses, held enormous collective influence. Any single house was weaker than the emperor, but united, the combined military strength of the Landsraad could overwhelm even the imperial household. This was the essential tension that kept the Imperium in a state of perpetual, fragile equilibrium. The emperor could not simply crush dissent whenever he pleased. He had to negotiate. He had to scheme. He had to maintain the illusion of fairness while secretly manipulating the board from behind the scenes. The Great Convention, a body of law and custom that governed relations between the houses, even included prohibitions on the use of atomic weapons against human populations, a rule that every house formally respected even as they searched for creative ways to gain advantage within its constraints. And there was a third pillar of power that made this balancing act even more precarious: the Spacing Guild. Without the Guild's hayliners, massive ships capable of folding space and transporting entire fleets between star systems, interstellar travel was impossible. And without the spice melange, the Guild navigators could not perceive the safe paths through fold space that made such travel survivable. This created a dependency chain of staggering consequence. Every political actor, every military strategist, every merchant and diplomat in the known universe was ultimately dependent on a single substance harvested from a single desert planet called Arrakis. The Guild needed spice. The Emperor needed the Guild. The houses needed the Emperor's stability. And everyone needed Arrakis. Herbert was drawing a direct parallel to petroleum politics on Earth, but he pushed the metaphor to its logical extreme, creating a universe where a single resource bottleneck shaped every decision at every level of galactic civilization. Now contrast all of this complexity, all of this layered, ritualistic, almost medieval architecture of power with the galactic empire of Star Wars. Palpatine's empire was born not from 10 millennia of slow consolidation, but from a single, breathtaking act of political theater. The Galactic Republic had stood for roughly 1,000 years, a sprawling, democratic, deeply bureaucratic institution that governed through the Senate on Coruscant. It was slow, it was corrupt, it was paralyzed by its own procedural complexity, its deliberative body so bloated with representatives from thousands of star systems that passing even the most basic legislation could take years of debate. And Sheev Palpatine, the Sith Lord, Darth Sidious, hiding in plain sight as a mild-mannered senator from Naboo, exploited every one of those weaknesses with surgical precision. He manufactured a crisis. The Separatist movement and the Clone Wars played both sides of the conflict like a master puppeteer. And then, when the galaxy was exhausted and terrified, he simply asked for more power, emergency powers, temporary authority that somehow never became temporary. And the Senate gave it to him. They gave it to him willingly, with applause, as Padme Amidala so famously observed in one of the prequel trilogy's most cutting lines. The transformation from republic to empire happened within a single generation, within a single lifetime. That speed is almost unthinkable when compared to the glacial pace of change in the Corrino Imperium, where political shifts played out over centuries, and the balance of power between houses evolved with the slowness of tectonic plates grinding against one another. The critical difference here is centralization, where the Corrino Imperium evolved over thousands of years into a delicate ecosystem of competing powers held in tension by mutual dependence. The Galactic Empire was engineered to concentrate all authority into one pair of hands. There was no Landsrat equivalent in Palpatine's galaxy. The Imperial Senate was allowed to persist for a time, yes, but it was a rubber stamp, a vestigial organ kept alive, only to maintain the pretense of legitimacy among systems that had not yet been fully pacified. And when even that pretense became unnecessary, Palpatine dissolved the Senate entirely, shortly before the Battle of Yavin. Regional governors, the Moffs and Grand Moffs, were given direct control over their territories, answerable only to the Emperor himself. The chain of command was vertical, absolute, and deliberately designed to prevent any horizontal alliances that might threaten the center. This top-down architecture was fast, it was efficient, and it was profoundly brittle in ways that the Corrino system was not. But to understand that brittleness, we first need to examine the instruments of fear that each empire wielded. The Corrino emperors had the Sardaukar. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were fanatics, warriors forged in the hellish conditions of the imperial prison planet Salusa Secundus. The surface of Salusa Secundus was a death world, ravaged by atomic bombardment centuries earlier, where survival itself was a form of military training more brutal than anything deliberately designed could ever be. Children grew up fighting for every scrap of food, every drop of water, every breath of survivable air. Disease was rampant. Predators roamed the wastelands. The weak died young, and the strong emerged with a ferocity that bordered on the inhuman. Those who survived this crucible were recruited into the Emperor's personal army, and their reputation was the cornerstone of Corrino military supremacy. A single Sardaukar legionnaire was said to be worth 10 ordinary soldiers from any other house. Their mere presence at a battlefield was often enough to end a conflict before it began. But here is the crucial detail that Frank Herbert embedded into the DNA of his universe. The Sardaukar were not infinite. They were not mass-produced on assembly lines or cloned in vats. They were a finite, organically cultivated resource, and their effectiveness depended on the continued brutality of Salusa Secundus. Herbert understood that the very conditions that created strength could also be replicated elsewhere, and that any advantage built on environmental hardship was inherently temporary. If another world produced warriors of equal caliber, the Corrino military advantage would evaporate. And that is precisely what happened. The Fremen of Arrakis, hardened by conditions that were arguably even more extreme than Seleucus Secundus, the relentless heat, the water scarcity, the ever-present danger of the sandworms, proved themselves not just equal to, but superior to the Emperor's finest. When Paul Atreides led the Fremen against the Sardaukar at the Battle of Arrakeen, the result was a revelation that shattered the Imperium's entire military calculus. Palpatine took a radically different approach. The Galactic Empire did not rely on a small force of elite warriors whose quality could be matched or surpassed. It relied on volume, on industrial scale, on the sheer, overwhelming weight of numbers and technology. The Stormtrooper Corps numbered in the millions, possibly billions, across the galaxy. They were standardized, interchangeable, equipped with mass-produced armor, mass-produced weapons, and mass-produced training protocols that emphasized obedience over individual initiative. They were not individually exceptional, and their accuracy with a blaster rifle has become something of a running joke among fans. But that was almost beside the point. The Empire's military doctrine was not about individual excellence. It was about omnipresence, about the psychological weight of seeing white armored soldiers on every street corner, in every spaceport, on every world that had even the slightest strategic value. And then there was the Death Star. Grand Moff Wilhuff Tarkin articulated the philosophy behind it with chilling clarity in what became known as the Tarkin Doctrine. The regional governors now have direct control over their territories. Fear will keep the local systems in line. Fear of this battle station. The idea was elegant in its brutality. You did not need to actually destroy every rebellious world. You only needed to destroy one. You needed a demonstration so horrifying that the very thought of resistance would become psychologically unbearable. Alderaan served as that demonstration. A peaceful, cultured, diplomatically significant world obliterated in seconds to prove that the Empire's threats were not hollow. Princess Leia was forced to watch her homeworld die. 2 billion people reduced to debris, as a lesson not just to her, but to every sentient being in the galaxy who might harbor thoughts of defiance. The destruction of Alderaan was terror industrialized, terror made mechanical, terror reduced to the cold simplicity of pressing a button. The Sardaukar inspired dread through personal combat prowess and the mystique of their origins. The Death Star inspired dread through the promise of absolute annihilation. Both were instruments of psychological control, but they operated at fundamentally different scales. One was a scalpel, the other was an asteroid. But empires do not run on fear alone. They run on resources. And this is perhaps the most illuminating axis of comparison between these two galactic civilizations. The Corrino Imperium was, at its core, a spice economy. Everything, and I do mean everything, revolved around melange. The spice extended life, sometimes by hundreds of years, for those who consumed it regularly. It expanded consciousness, granting heightened awareness and, in sufficient quantities, prescient visions of possible futures. It enabled the Spacing Guild navigators to perceive safe paths through fold space, making interstellar travel possible. It fueled the Bene Gesserit's abilities of other memory, that extraordinary capacity to access the genetic memories of all their female ancestors stretching back thousands of generations. It was addictive, irreplaceable, and it came from only one place in the entire known universe: Arrakis, Dune, the desert planet. Produced by the life cycle of the great sandworms and impossible to synthesize artificially, at least until the events that unfolded millennia later in the novels. This created an economic and political reality that was both elegant and terrifyingly fragile. Whoever controlled Arrakis controlled the spice. Whoever controlled the spice controlled the universe. The Emperor managed this through a system of planetary fiefs, granting stewardship of Arrakis to a great house that would oversee spice harvesting operations and pay a substantial percentage to the Imperial treasury. This was mediated through Choam, the Combine Hanate Ober Advancer Mercantiles, a universal development corporation in which the Emperor held the largest single block of shares, followed by the great houses and the guild. Choam was the economic engine of the Imperium, and directorship within it was as coveted as military rank. Herbert modeled it explicitly on the great colonial trading companies that had shaped Earth's own history of empire and exploitation. Palpatine, by contrast, had no such single point of dependency, and he had no patience for the kind of delicate economic diplomacy that the spice trade demanded. The Galactic Empire's resource strategy was built around total industrial mobilization on a scale that staggered the imagination. Star Destroyers, those iconic dagger-shaped warships, each required enormous quantities of raw materials. The Death Star consumed resources on a level that bordered on the absurd, with entire planetary mining operations and orbital shipyards dedicated solely to feeding its construction over the course of roughly 2 decades. The Empire strip-mined worlds without hesitation, enslaved entire species like the Wookiees of Kashyyyk to provide forced labor, and redirected the economic output of thousands of star systems toward military production. Where the Corrino Imperium depended on one fragile resource bottleneck and had to manage it with political finesse, the Galactic Empire diversified its extraction across the entire galaxy and managed it with brute force. But this industrial approach had its own vulnerabilities, ones that Palpatine either failed to recognize or simply did not care about. Every enslaved worker was a future rebel. Every depleted world was a recruitment poster for the Alliance. Every family displaced by Imperial mining operations or forced into servitude in the shipyards carried with them a burning grievance that compounded over time. The Rebel Alliance was not born from a single dramatic act of resistance. It grew slowly, organically, from 1,000 small injustices that the Empire's bureaucracy was too vast and too indifferent to notice until it was too late. There is another dimension to this resource question that deserves attention, and that is the control of movement itself. In the Dune universe, all interstellar travel was monopolized by the Spacing Guild. No house, not even the Emperor, maintained an independent fleet of faster-than-light ships. If you wanted to move armies, trade goods, or even send diplomats to another world, you booked passage on a Guild Hayliner, and you paid whatever the Guild demanded. This gave the navigators an extraordinary form of passive power. They rarely intervened in politics directly, but the threat of withholding transport services was a leverage point that could bring any house to its knees. The Guild's neutrality was the invisible scaffolding that held the entire Imperium together, and their dependence on spice meant they would never permit anything to disrupt melange production, even if it meant tolerating injustice on a massive scale. In the Star Wars galaxy, by contrast, hyperspace travel was decentralized. Any ship with a functioning hyperdrive could jump between star systems independently. There was no central gatekeeper controlling movement. The Empire maintained dominance over key hyperspace lanes through naval patrols and blockades, but rebels, smugglers, and pirates could always find alternate routes through the less charted regions of the Outer Rim. This made the Galactic Empire harder to topple through economic pressure, but also much harder to fully control, because the galaxy's arteries of movement could never be entirely sealed. We must also speak of the courts, the corridors of power where decisions are made not with blasters or crysknives, but with words, glances, and carefully poisoned cups of spiced coffee. The Imperial Court on Kaitane, the Corrino throne world, was a place of extraordinary sophistication. Imagine the court of Louis XIV at Versailles, with its rigid hierarchies, its elaborate rituals of etiquette, its gardens and banquets and whispered conspiracies, and then multiply it by the complexity of a civilization spanning thousands of worlds. The Bene Gesserit moved through these halls like shadows, their sisterhood, a transgenerational conspiracy spanning millennia. They bred bloodlines with the patience of master geneticists, planted religious myths on distant worlds through the Missionaria Productiva to prepare those populations for future manipulation, and trained their adepts in the art of voice, a technique that could compel obedience through precisely modulated tones and inflections. They were advisors, consorts, truthsayers, and spies, and no emperor could afford to ignore their influence even as he resented their secretive autonomy. The Mentats served a different but equally vital function. Trained from childhood to be human computers, they replaced the thinking machines banned by the Butlerian Jihad. A Mentat could process vast quantities of data, identify patterns invisible to ordinary perception, and project probabilities with uncanny accuracy. They served as advisors and strategists to the great houses, and their calculations often determined the outcome of political maneuvers long before any physical confrontation occurred. Thufir Hawat, the Atreides master of assassins, exemplified the Mentat ideal, a mind so sharp and so disciplined that even when captured and manipulated by the Harkonnens, his strategic instincts remained formidable. Herbert drew deeply from real-world history when constructing this feudal architecture. The Landsraad bears striking resemblance to the Holy Roman Empire's Imperial Diet, a gathering of semi-autonomous lords who collectively check the power of the emperor while competing with one another for advantage. Choam functioned much like the Dutch East India Company, an organization that wielded economic power rivaling that of nation-states. Herbert was a student of history, ecology, and political science, and every element of his imperium reflected the messy, contradictory, deeply human realities of how power operates when it must sustain itself across unimaginable spans of time. The court on Coruscant was a very different beast. Yes, political players existed, the Imperial Ruling Council, the intelligence agencies like the ISB, the competing military branches, all created pockets of bureaucratic infighting that Palpatine deliberately cultivated to prevent any subordinate from accumulating too much independent power. But ultimately, every thread of authority led back to one figure. Every decision of consequence required his approval. And Palpatine's mastery of the dark side of the Force gave him tools that no Corrino Emperor could have imagined. He could sense betrayal before it was consciously formed in the mind of the betrayer. He could manipulate emotions across vast distances, cloud the judgment of entire rooms full of experienced politicians, and project an aura of authority so overwhelming that Grand Admirals and Moffs would find themselves unable to voice objections even when they knew a course of action was leading toward disaster. This is a fundamental, structural difference. The Corrino Emperor was powerful, but he was human, fallible, mortal, subject to the same cognitive limitations and emotional vulnerabilities as any other person. He could be deceived, outmaneuvered, and overthrown through conventional political and military means. Shaddam IV was deposed not by a supernatural force, but by military defeat at the hands of the Fremen, political isolation within the Landsraad, and the catastrophic loss of his monopoly on elite warriors. It is worth noting that Shaddam's downfall was partly self-inflicted. His decision to conspire with Baron Vladimir Harkonnen to destroy House Atreides on Arrakis was driven by jealousy and paranoia, a fear that Duke Leto's growing popularity among the other houses might eventually threaten Corrino supremacy. In trying to eliminate a rival, Shaddam set in motion the chain of events that would produce his own replacement. His Sardaukar fought alongside Harkonnen troops in the attack on the Atreides stronghold, a secret alliance that violated the spirit, if not the letter, of the Great Convention. When this collaboration was eventually revealed, it cost the Emperor whatever goodwill he still retained among the Landsraad. Palpatine was something more, a nexus of dark side energy, a figure whose power derived not just from institutional authority, but from a metaphysical source that ordinary beings could neither comprehend nor counter without access to the Force themselves. And this brings us inevitably to the question of legacy. How did these empires fall? And what does the manner of their falling reveal about their deepest nature? The Corrino Imperium did not collapse in fire and explosion. It was supplanted. Paul Atreides, the Kwisatz Haderach, the messianic figure that the Bene Gesserit had spent millennia trying to breed into existence, arrived on Arrakis and became something the Imperium's power structure could not accommodate. He united the Fremen, seized control of spice production, and presented the Emperor with an ultimatum backed by the threat of destroying all melange forever. Shaddam had no choice but to abdicate. But here is what makes Herbert's vision so profound and so deeply unsettling. The fall of the Corrinos did not lead to liberation. It led to something arguably worse. Paul's Fremen jihad swept across the known universe, killing 61 billion people and sterilizing 90 planets. The messianic figure that the Imperium's own religious and genetic engineering had helped create became a force of destruction that dwarfed anything the Sardaukar had inflicted in 10,000 years of Corrino rule. Herbert was making a deliberate, uncomfortable point. He was warning against the seduction of charismatic leaders, against the human tendency to surrender agency and critical thought to those who promised transcendence. Paul knew the jihad was coming. He saw it in his prescient visions, and he could not stop it. The forces he had unleashed were beyond even his control, because they were rooted not in his personal ambition, but in the deep, primal human hunger for a Messiah. And then came Leto II, Paul's son, who took the lesson even further. The God Emperor ruled for 3,500 years, a human consciousness fused with the body of a sandworm, deliberately becoming the worst tyrant in human history, so that humanity would never again permit itself to be ruled so completely by a single being. His golden path was a calculated act of oppression designed to breed into the human species an instinctive, almost genetic revulsion against centralized power. He suppressed space travel, restricted the spice, crushed every rebellion, and made himself so utterly despised that when he finally allowed himself to be killed, humanity scattered across the stars in a great diaspora called the Scattering, fleeing so far and so fast that no single catastrophe or tyrant could ever again threaten the species as a whole. It was tyranny as vaccine. Despotism as inoculation. This is political philosophy operating at a scale and depth that very few works of fiction have ever attempted. The Galactic Empire's fall was, by comparison, almost mechanical. It hinged on a thermal exhaust port, a deliberate design vulnerability planted by Galen Erso, the reluctant scientist coerced into building the Death Star's superlaser, was smuggled to the Rebel Alliance by his daughter Jyn, and exploited by Luke Skywalker in a single impossible shot guided by the Force. 4 years later, at the Battle of Endor, Palpatine was killed when Darth Vader, in a final redemptive act, chose his son over his master and hurled the Emperor into the reactor shaft of the second Death Star. And with Palpatine's death, the Empire fractured almost immediately. The military governors turned on each other, the fleet splintered into competing factions, and the new republic emerged from the chaos to rebuild democratic governance. This is the inherent and fatal weakness of extreme centralization. When everything depends on one person, the loss of that person is catastrophic. The Corrino system, for all its stagnation and infuriating slowness, was designed to survive the death of any individual emperor. The institutions endured, the Landsraad persisted, the Guild continued to fold space, the Bene Gesserit carried on their breeding programs, Choam kept the wheels of commerce turning. These structures existed independently of who sat on the Golden Lion throne. The Galactic Empire had no such resilience. Its Senate was dissolved, its institutions were hollow, its military governors were loyal to Palpatine personally, not to any abstract principle of governance. When the keystone was removed, the entire arch collapsed. Even Palpatine's eventual return, whether in the old Legends continuity with its clone emperors, or the sequel trilogy's resurrection on Exegol, reinforces this point. The Empire could not function without him. Every attempt to revive Imperial authority required literally reviving Palpatine, because the system he built contained no mechanism for legitimate succession, no institutional memory capable of self-governance, no tradition of power sharing that could distribute authority when the center failed. So what does all of this tell us? What is the deeper truth buried in the comparison of these two fictional empires? Perhaps it is this. There are two fundamental approaches to holding power across the stars. You can build a system so complex, so layered with competing interests and mutual dependencies, that no single actor can ever fully control it. In doing so, you create something that endures but stagnates, something stable but resistant to the kinds of change that might improve the lives of its subjects, something that survives for millennia but at the cost of freezing human potential in amber. That is the Corrino way. Or you can build a system so streamlined, so ruthlessly efficient, so concentrated in its authority that it can reshape the galaxy in a single generation. You can crush dissent with technological terror, mobilize resources on an unimaginable scale, and impose your will across 1,000,000 star systems with breathtaking speed. But in doing so, you create something fundamentally fragile: a glass cannon, a colossus with feet of clay, an edifice that dominates the galaxy for decades but cannot survive the loss of a single man. That is Palpatine's way. Frank Herbert and George Lucas were both, in their own ways, writing cautionary tales about the nature of power. Herbert was the more cerebral, more interested in systems, ecology, and the long arcs of history. He wanted his readers to distrust heroes, to question anyone who claimed to have all the answers, to understand that the most dangerous person in the universe is not the tyrant, but the savior. Lucas was more mythological, drawing from Joseph Campbell's monomyth to tell a story about good, evil, and personal redemption that operates on the level of fairy tale and archetype. But both arrived at a remarkably similar conclusion. Empires fall. They always fall. The only question is how much damage they do on the way down, and whether anything worthwhile survives in their wake. The Corrino Imperium left behind a universe that would eventually produce the God Emperor's Golden Path, a plan to scatter humanity so thoroughly across the cosmos that no single catastrophe could threaten the species. The Galactic Empire left behind a galaxy scarred and struggling to rebuild, finding in the sequel era that the shadow of empire is not so easily escaped. There is a poignant irony in both legacies that fans of these universes have long debated. The Corrino Imperium, despite its flaws, at least produced stable conditions under which billions of people lived relatively predictable lives for thousands of years. Its very stagnation was, in a perverse way, a form of protection. Nothing changed, but nothing catastrophically collapsed either. The moment a visionary arrived to shake the system loose, the death toll was almost beyond reckoning. In the Star Wars galaxy, the Republic's democratic ideals were beautiful in theory, but could not prevent the rise of a dictator. And the empire that replaced it, for all its horror, did maintain a kind of order. A terrible order built on fear, but order nonetheless. When it fell, civil war consumed the galaxy, and within a generation, the First Order rose from its ashes to repeat the cycle. Neither universe offers an easy answer about what good governance looks like. Both suggest that the structures we build to protect ourselves are always, inevitably, the same structures that will one day be turned against us. Both universes remind us that the architecture of power matters. Not just who holds the throne, but how the throne is built, whether the pillars beneath it are many or few, whether the mortar binding them is fear or interdependence, whether the foundation rests on rock or on sand. And on that thought, as the stars wheel slowly overhead and the silence of deep space settles around us, we leave these two empires to their fates, the golden lion throne gathering dust in the empty halls of Khitain, the Imperial palace on Coruscant, its corridors silent, its surveillance systems dark. Two visions of galactic order, both magnificent in their ambition, both doomed by their design, both carrying within them from the very first day the quiet, patient seeds of their own unraveling. Sleep well and dream of stars.